Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmiri welcoming our viewers from around the world to this program of US and China in the world. This program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout this program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll try, time permitting, to get as many of them as we can. My guest today is Dr. David Carment, professor at Carleton University, Norman Paterson School of International Affairs in Ottawa, Canada. He is series editor for Palgrave, Canada and International Affairs, editor of the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He was fellow at the Hoover Institution and Harvard's Belfer Center, and is author, editor, or co-editor of 21 books. In 2017, Carment was a visiting scholar at the World Institute for Development Economic Research, Finland, and fellow at the Center for Global Cooperation Research in Germany. Please welcome Dr. Carment. Good morning, Dr. Carment. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Is it snowing? Is it snowing in Ottawa?
Not yet. Maybe in a couple of months. But right now we're in a heat wave, as are you, no doubt.
Well, listen, you're very kind to take time to join us. I know how busy you are. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to get started. You've described Canadian foreign policy as adrift in the world. Mm-hmm. Do you still think so? After all, on Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, Canadian strategy appears to be anything but adrift. It's in lockstep with the United States. What do you think?
Well, that's exactly why I would argue that Canada is adrift in the world. We are beholden to the United States. We are driven largely by its foreign policy agenda. We are a country that is in search of an international community that has itself broken away from the larger international system. A range of countries have chosen to break free from what we would call the international community. We are a country in search of some kind of international order that is upheld by what some might call a rules-based order or a rules-based system. In other words, all the ideas that have motivated and the principles and the values and interests that have motivated Canada's foreign policy in the past seem to not have the kind of traction that we're used to. And as such, then we are adrift. Our recourse is, under those conditions, is to look to what we would call like-minded states. Those countries we believe who share our values, most notably the United States. The irony here, of course, is that by virtue of trying to pursue a course of action that is in our interests, which is largely identified by working closely with the United States, we find ourselves more closely integrated with the United States. There are a number of practical reasons for that, not the least of which is the decline of globalization and the reduction of supply chains, which bring us closer to the United States as a trading partner. So there are a number of reasons why I think it's fair to say that Canada is adrift. We're in search of the things that we have found valuable to us in the past as guideposts, and at the same time, we're uncertain about the kind of world that we're confronting. And we're, in other words, charting a course that's navigable, but we certainly don't have a very good map in which to engage the world.
But let me ask you, you've mentioned something that in the past there were guideposts that channeled, in my words, channeled Canada's foreign policy. What are some of these guideposts that you're saying Canada may have lost?
Well, certainly the virtue of Canada is that we see ourselves as a globalized nation. We see ourselves as a diaspora nation, a nation that is connected by a range of cultures collectively. And we seem to now find it very convenient to disconnect with the states that are often seen as countries that are not sharing our values. We are pursuing a strategy that would see us work within a smaller circle of friends. And this is anathema, I think, to the principles of what has driven the Canadian economy, namely free trade. The most obvious example would be, of course, our delinking from the so-called China-based economy. Whether you agree that China will overtake the United States, this has been a key driver of our growth, certainly out west, perhaps notwithstanding the importance of the U.S. free trade agreement that we have. Nevertheless, we're now challenging the various principles of free trade. To give you a concrete example, our finance minister has proposed something called friendshoring, which would see us trade only with those states whose values we share.
Really?
Now, this goes against basic. Yeah, so friendshoring entails seeking out detailed, integrated economic relations with countries who we trust, who have had a reliable trading partnership with us in the past. But we know that free market principles, not the least of which based on comparative advantage, requires us to engage countries we don't see eye to eye with. So friendshoring is an idea as a counterbalance to disengaging from China, possibly even Russia and other countries, seems very difficult proposition for us to pursue in the long run. Ultimately, Canada is a trading nation. We derive a significant portion of our economic growth from trade, and that trade cannot be entirely dependent on the United States. So I would say a functional multilateral trading system, rules-based, would be absolutely essential. That would be one underpinning principle to Canadian foreign policy. The second one, of course, would be finding a balance between American influence and coercion, whether it's interpreted in friendly ways or not, against wanting and need to work closely with the United States in a number of key files.
But David,
there's been enough.
No, sorry, I'm interrupting again. But what you've just said, I find very interesting because as we read it in the United States, Canada is trying to go beyond the recent tips that the country has had with China. I mean, Mr. Trudeau has set up an advisory committee to advise him on future of Canadian-Chinese relations. Last year, 2021, was the best trading year since 2018. Canada's trade with China grew 14%. So are you suggesting that there is a cleavage within the Trudeau government as to what Canada's foreign policy going forward should be? Sorry to interrupt, but I think this is important for the viewers.
It's an absolutely crucial question to ask. I would say it's not just a cleavage within the Canadian government or the current Liberal government, but within academia, within the media space, within our bureaucracy. And that cleavage is primarily dominated by the question of how we should engage China and who should we work with in engaging China. So on the one hand, we have I guess the security and defense community who move in lockstep with their counterparts in the United States.
Right.
We all know that for the United States, China is defined as an existential threat. The current Canadian ambassador to Ottawa, the American ambassador, has stated that China constitutes an existential threat. When China is defined in those ways, then one would look to our security and defense community to calibrate whether or not we agree with them. And in fact, they do agree in principle with that perspective, whether that's defined in terms of cybersecurity or military threats within the region where China dominates and so on. That's one aspect or one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is I think the much more interesting one, which is the economic relationship, which, as you've noted, our economic growth has increased. Our trading relationship with China has increased over the last several years. It was one of the few countries that saw economic growth during the pandemic, and we benefited from that growth. Interestingly, Australia, being a country that delinked and chose to downsize its trading relationship with China, and China retaliated by cutting off coal imports from Australia. Canada
Right.
moved in to take over that coal market, to provide coal to China in the absence of that Australian export to China. So interestingly, the alliance of values or the friendshoring can only be taken so far. We realized that there was an economic opportunity for Canada to achieve economic gains, possibly at the expense of an ally. So my basic point is that we have this dichotomy. I think it will never be fully addressed under the current government. They're happy with the rhetorical stance they take. It doesn't help that we've had blowback on the arrest of Meng Wanzhou and then the detention of the two Michaels. As you know, we've also made a decision on Huawei, which more or less was a non-decision because it was made well after the market had received the signal from the Canadian government that they would downsize Huawei's presence in Canada. But what we witness in these particular instances is the security domain exercising its influence across the U.S. and Canada. I think we can safely say now, in hindsight, that the arrest of the two Michaels, the detention of the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou's arrest was largely political theater for the purposes of advancing American interests, and Canada was only too happy to fall in lockstep with the American approach. One could define that as extraterritorial overreach by the United States into Canada. Sadly, though, the departure of Huawei from Canada, I think, was more a reflection of the lack of competitiveness within the United States. The United States does not have at this point, along with Canada, I think a viable competitor to 5G networks that Huawei is providing to the world. And we're also lagging on the BRICS, the initiative that China has advanced regarding its infrastructure programs globally.
But David, I have to tell you this. Some years ago, I was talking to a very senior, I have a two-part question, very senior Canadian foreign ministry official. And he told me that when people join that agency, that very early on, they are instructed that, listen, in a public meeting with other countries, you can disagree with America as much as you want. But whenever a vote is called for, you must always vote with the United States. He told me that's how our people are trained if they want to get ahead, right? So given this and America's eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation with China, and the fact former Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, last week in a speech said, we have to just pay attention that more than half of the world's growth is going to come from Asia going forward. So where I'm going with this is the American Congress is at this point trying to craft a bill which will involve Canada compulsorily in America's foreign policy on China. So putting all of this together, what choices does Canada really have? What do you think?
Let's go. That's again an excellent question, because the premise here is that by hook or by crook, the United States is going to find a way in which Canada will be inculcated into its foreign policy agenda. You mentioned the bill that's being pushed through. There's a Competition Innovation Act, which will identify Canada as a key partner in the American Competition Innovation Act, which is going to focus on a number of things. But typically, let's take technology and cybersecurity, for example. Canada is mentioned 30 times in that act, and Canada is identified as a key partner in the development of various technologies that can combat Chinese capabilities and so on. So the American approach will be to put money in our way such that there will be an incentive for us to cooperate, such as the American strategy that we will be seen as an essential partner, but in fact will be a junior partner. Make no mistake about it, China looms large in everything that Canada has done on the foreign policy front, but it's often not so obvious. Our current Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly, was given a mandate letter after coming to office following the election of last year. China looms large in every statement that she was asked to address, and yet it isn't specified as such. China's there, but not there, whether it's on environment, on security, on values and democracy, and so on. In similar fashion, the roadmap that the Canada and the U.S. agreed to after the meeting between Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden following Joe Biden's election, the roadmap for renewed partnership also clearly identifies China as a key target for a common and joint foreign policy agenda, although it isn't named as such. So there's a lot between the lines that needs to be read. Clearly, Canada and China are going to be working, Canada and the U.S. are going to be working together on the foreign policy front with respect to China. What concerns me is the lack of debate within the Canadian context. And I'm not convinced that the committee that you mentioned, the advisory group that our foreign ministers put together to provide guidance on Indo-Pacific relations is going to meet that challenge, because what is often presented as a consensus, as you rightly point out, is lack of consensus. There's a clear division within Canada, as there are in other states, on how to engage China. To give you an example, we have a free trade negotiation process with both India and Indonesia. But let's imagine, for example, we develop a free trade agreement with Indonesia, a country we've had a long-standing relationship with. Well, China's I think, the largest investor in the Indonesian economy. So whether we recognize it or not, we're going to be working with China indirectly. And these are the realities, I think, that the economic community, the trading, the commercial side of our foreign policy recognize, that it's inevitable that we work with and engage China. How we do so really is a function of how we advance our own independent agenda outside of U.S. interests, because the U.S. has a very security-oriented, defense-oriented agenda. And the enablers within Canada who support that need to speak up and say, this is not necessarily in our interests.
But David, if I remember correctly, only a mere 14% of Canadians think very highly of China. And so what does that do to any change in policy?
Well, let's be careful how we phrase that. I mean, I think you're right, 14%. I mean, the media has done a masterful job in polarizing Canadian society, and such that, and I would say the Globe and Mail has done a terrific job in identifying China as a threat. But I think there's much more nuance here. When you speak of 14%, that means that the balance probably don't see China as a viable trading partner, which works against our interests. More troubling is, do they see Chinese people as a threat? And this is where then Canada as a diaspora nation has to come to grips with the realities of our foreign policy, which is increasingly confrontational and straining our relations with the people who are of Chinese descent in Canada. There is deep concern on how, for example, Chinese academics in Canada are being targeted unfairly.
Really?
There's growing concern about racism within Canada regarding China and so on. And this is partly a function, I think, of the polarizing aspects of how our media has portrayed our relationship with China. I would say in this respect that any polls or surveys that you review will probably be driven largely by how sharp the headlines are in today's newspaper. The Uyghur genocide, for example, which is controversial to say the least, is an example in which China is highlighted as a country that does not share our values. Although we could find many examples of countries with whom we do trade or sell our commodities or our weapons, such as Saudi Arabia, who have equally abysmal, if not greater, human rights abuses. So we have the rhetorical gap between how we engage and what our realities are. I think our economic relationship will be largely defined on how we can navigate an independent path. We need to bring all our capacities to bear to manage that triangular relationship, the one between us, China, and the United States, and stay clear of any confrontational strategy that could bring harm to Canadians at home.
So where do you think, David, just continue on what you're saying, but I want to inject a question about the business community in China. Another thing that, at least in America, we continue hearing is that the business community really wants to deepen their business relationship with China, looking ahead at the 21st century, larger economy, most of the growth, the past 3 decades, almost 30% of the growth in world GDP has come from China. So is there not just a bifurcation within the government, but a trifurcation, if there is such a word, where the business community also wants to go one way from where the rest of the government seems to want to go? Can you shed any light on all this?
Well, I think here you're going to find a regional variation. So Western Canada, I think, is much more interested in developing that economic relationship with China and maintaining it, sustaining it. Our agricultural output benefits from that trading relationship with China, as does increasing our energy sector. I mean, make no mistake about it. During COVID or the pandemic in Canada, our energy prices were going up largely because not because of domestic consumption, but because the energy exporters were finding new markets in Asia Pacific. And that has to be sustained if we're sincere about developing our export capabilities. Where I think you get less support for that economic trading relationship is where China is seen as a clear competitor to our manufacturing sectors, probably to some extent in Ontario, possibly Quebec as well. But it is very much driven by that regional variation. I would say what's important here in that context is that we can't really understand how we would engage China economically without understanding how the United States is doing so. We forget that Donald Trump engaged in a round of free trade talks with China. They've completed round 1. But we also signed into force an agreement with the United States, the Canada, US, Mexico Free Trade Agreement, which stipulated that no member of that tripartite free trade agreement could initiate talks with a non-market economy. And that essentially prevented Canada from engaging any further free trade discussion with China, which we were in process of doing. For the better part of 10 years. That didn't prevent the United States from pursuing a similar kind of free trade process with China. So the US wants to benefit itself, let's make no mistake about it, and even if that comes at Canada's expense. And I think that's a good example of how US will always pursue its own interests, and we have to be equally smart and equally savvy, put ourselves first, if you will. And if that means being a little more reluctant, a little more circumspect about US interests and the US agenda, then so be it. But right now, I don't see that coming from the security and defense communities, which are essentially mimicking, echoing everything that's coming from the United States.
And what you've alluded to earlier is that trying to find a way to do this, you've mentioned that Canada should try to align itself with like-minded middle market countries. I mean, you've mentioned Australia, perhaps Mexico. Is this an active scenario that is being played out in Ottawa? Is there an initiative to try to do this, or is it too early?
Well, okay, there's a couple of answers to that question. One is that Canada has tried repeatedly since the Liberal government came into power to seek out like-minded states. So when the two Michaels were detained, Canada tried to get a list of countries that would sign on condemning that detention. It didn't go very well. They got a handful of countries, but not a lot. Most of these countries were so-called members of the Alliance of Values, democracies and so on, many from Scandinavia as well as Western Europe. More recently, there have been several other initiatives to build this kind of momentum, all of which have not really panned out very well. The most notable, of course, being this small coalition of 30 countries that are working to pressure Russia from pulling out of Ukraine. But more realistically, what we're seeing is the reality of engaging countries who are on the border. Let's pick India as an example. A country that is clearly charting its own path, its own course. And we are in discussions with India over a free trade agreement. This has been ongoing for 15 years, whether it pans out or not. But these are the countries that we need to find alliance with, because they are the emerging markets. These are the growth economies. India is a growth economy, obviously not doing so well, as are the states of Southeast Asia. These are not countries that are going to stand out in terms of stellar human rights records or high-performing democracies, but they are countries that are important because they have the demographic characteristics to their advantage, a large youth bulge, if you will, as we often characterize it. They have commodities that we are interested in trading for. We have things that they want, and vice versa. And they are tightly bound in some cases to a growing economy, namely China. Conversely, working with countries that are like-minded ties us in with largely aging white populations whose economies are very similar to ours, heavily dominated by the service sector. The future will probably belong to economies that have commodities. Canada has that advantage. US less so. Russia has that advantage. China to some extent, but not significantly. We have some of the cards in our favor, and we should play them as adeptly as possible. So I'm a little skeptical about the alliance of values, in part because I think countries are much more savvy in how they will engage, and we need to be equally savvy. By that I mean they have interests, and a smaller state like Canada should be able to find various niche areas where it can engage. Countries that are dominated by both China and the United States, for example, in the digital rights domain, the leaders there are Japan, China, and the US.
Right.
We need smaller countries who can work. So I'd say it's not necessarily just countries we need to seek out, but also issue areas where we think we can collaborate with smaller countries.
Okay, I'm saving a juicy question for last. We're running out of time, but I want to get this in. So recently, there was a reception at the Russian embassy in Ottawa, and one of the officials from your foreign ministry attended, right? And there was a huge brouhaha, and they said we hadn't seen an email and so on. So now there's a group in America that says, look, they clamped down and it was a mistake and so on. There's another group that says this is China playing their historical role and making sure that if there is negotiation to end the Ukrainian war, that Canada will have some influence. So that's why nobody was fired and so on, that this happened. In the couple of minutes we have, where do you come out on this?
Well, first of all, I think we should apologize to the woman who was sent on behalf of GAC. She's been deeply integrated within the diplomatic community at Foreign Affairs Canada and should not have been treated like some kind of instrument of foreign policy. I think it was wrong for Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland and others to condemn this action. I think there was full knowledge of what she was doing. I'm not going to speak to her linkage back to Paul Heimberger, who is a longstanding career civil servant at the highest level. But ultimately, I'll say diplomats should be diplomats. Let them do their job. They know what they're doing. I think this crisis, if you will, which I think was highly overblown, is a result of two things. A media that is desperate to find scandal within the government, in fact, any government that's elected, and a significant influence from diaspora lobbying, namely the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which brought this to their attention. They've done something similar regarding the sale of the or the return of the turbines to Germany, the Russian turbines, which Canada was on contract to repair. It's not their place to, well, certainly they can speak out on it, but they do not dictate foreign policy. And this is the disturbing relationship that our current finance minister, Christopher Freeland, has with the Ukrainian community in Canada. Once we allow, well, in fact, it's happened, Canada's a diaspora nation. Once Canada begins to have an agenda that's beholden to particular groups, then I think we need to question the foundations of our foreign policy. So I think fundamentally it was wrong for this action to be condemned. It was a diplomatic move. It was symbolic in nature. You know, at some point, Canada has to engage. You can't, as I said, we are adrift, to bring it full circle to your original point. And being adrift means finding an anchor. And finding an anchor means going into tough areas of the world. That's what diplomats should do, even if it's at home. But let diplomats be diplomats. Trudeau came to power saying, let's unleash our diplomats and let them do their job. Instead, what he did is he turned his back on them and said, sorry, this was the wrong thing to do. It never should have happened. And that statement was done purely for political reasons to save his bacon, Canadian bacon.
Thank you so much for forthright answer to my, as I described, the juicy question. Professor David Carment from Carleton University, you were very kind to give us all of this time and speak to our viewers from around the world. I really, really appreciate and thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Sarwar. It's been a great pleasure for me to join with you today, and I look forward to future conversations. I wish you best of luck in what is a terrific show. I really enjoy watching it.
Thank you so much. And let me now take the opportunity to also thank our viewers from around the world. This is polarislive.com. As you know, this program deals with the United States and China, but in the wider world. And Canada and India and Australia are part of what we hope to increasingly cover. I hope you will join us again next week when we have a top-ranking politician from India who will talk about the opposition in India, about India's relationships with China, and the growing, supposedly, alliance on security matters with the United States. Until then, goodbye.